This shouldn't be possible. Some of the strangest Star Wars ripoffs ever made are actually better than you expect. How did cheap imitations, built on stolen ideas, rushed scripts, and questionable effects, end up creating scenes people still remember decades later? Because hidden inside the chaos are moments that almost outshine the original, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. But one of these films goes so far, it crosses a line you won't believe. 10. The Shape of Things to Come, 1979. At first glance, it barely resembles the scale it's trying to imitate. No sweeping galaxy, no massive conflict, just fragments, scenes that feel disconnected, almost uncertain of their own direction. And that's where it becomes interesting, because instead of building a grand universe, the film leans into something smaller and stranger. Robots that don't feel advanced, but unpredictable. Environments that look controlled, yet oddly lifeless. It doesn't expand outward, it compresses inward. That creates a different kind of tension. Not spectacle, but limitation. You start noticing how every scene feels slightly off. Dialogue pauses too long. Movements feel delayed. Even action lacks urgency, like everything is happening a second too late. And instead of breaking immersion, it creates a new one. Because now you're not watching for story. You're watching for irregularity. That's what makes it work. Not as a competitor to Star Wars, but as something misaligned enough to stay in your memory. It doesn't impress you. It unsettles you. And that's harder to forget. 9. Star Odyssey, 1979. This one doesn't try to hide what it's doing. From the very beginning, it mirrors familiar ideas. Space empires, glowing weapons, and a conflict that feels borrowed rather than built. But then something shifts. The visuals don't aim for realism. They exaggerate. Costumes become brighter, movements become sharper, weapons glow in ways that feel more theatrical than functional. And suddenly, it stops feeling like imitation and starts feeling like interpretation. Because instead of recreating Star Wars, it amplifies its surface. Everything is louder, more artificial, more obvious. And that creates a strange kind of honesty. You're not being asked to believe it. You're being asked to watch it. That distinction matters, because once expectation drops, attention changes. You begin noticing the choreography, the rhythm of scenes, the way action is staged rather than hidden. It becomes less about immersion and more about experience. And in that shift, the film finds its identity, not as a hidden masterpiece, but as something bold enough to embrace its own exaggeration. And sometimes that's more engaging than perfection. 8. Space Raiders, 1983. It begins with something familiar, a young character, a larger conflict, a journey that feels structured, almost predictable. But then the tone starts to fracture, because this isn't a clean heroic arc. It's unstable. Characters don't behave like heroes, they react like survivors. Decisions feel rushed, situations escalate without warning, and underneath it all, there's a different energy. This isn't about destiny, it's about momentum. Scenes don't build carefully, they move quickly. Almost too quickly, as if the film itself is trying to stay ahead of something. That creates tension you don't expect, because instead of waiting for payoff, you're constantly adjusting. And then there's the structure, pieces of other films stitched together, reused, repurposed. Normally, that breaks immersion. Here, it adds unpredictability. You never fully know what's coming next, because the film itself doesn't feel stable. And that instability becomes its strength. It doesn't guide you, it pushes you forward, and by the time it slows down, you've already committed to the ride. 7. Space Hunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, 1983. It opens like a chase, not a mission, not a destiny, just movement, and that immediately changes the tone, because instead of building a structured universe, the film drops you into something already in motion, a wasteland, a pursuit, a world that feels broken before you even understand it. This isn't space as exploration, it's space as survival. Everything feels worn down. Environments aren't clean, they're hostile. Characters aren't idealistic, they're practical. Even the humor feels sharper, like it's cutting through tension rather than easing it. And that's where it separates itself. Because instead of trying to match Star Wars scale, it narrows the focus. Smaller stakes, immediate danger. But that makes every decision feel heavier. You're not watching heroes save the galaxy. You're watching people try to get through the next moment. And then there's the pacing. It doesn't slow down to explain. It keeps moving, forcing you to keep up. That creates engagement through pressure. And you don't relax into the story. You stay alert. And in that constant tension, the film finds its identity, not as a grand epic, but as something sharper, more direct, more unpredictable, and harder to look away from. 6. Message from Space, 1978. At first, it feels larger than it should. Costumes, armor, dramatic entrances, everything signals scale. But the structure underneath is different. This isn't built like a Western-inspired space opera. It's built like a legend. And that changes everything, because instead of focusing on one central hero, the film spreads its attention across multiple characters, each carrying a piece of the story, not the whole of it. That fragmentation creates movement. You're not following a straight path, you're navigating a network of events. And within that structure, something unexpected happens. The film stops feeling like imitation and starts feeling like translation. It takes familiar elements, rebellion, empire, destiny, and reshapes them through a different cultural lens. The tone becomes more dramatic, more symbolic. Moments aren't just actions, they're declarations, and that gives even simple scenes weight, because they're not just progressing the story, they're reinforcing meaning. The pacing reflects that too. It moves forward, but pauses just long enough to let moments settle. Not rushed, not stretched, controlled. And that control creates contrast between chaos and structure, between spectacle and intention. So while it begins as something recognizable, it evolves into something distinct. Not louder than Star Wars, but more stylized. And in that stylization, it becomes memorable for a completely different reason. 5. Starchaser, The Legend of Orin, 1985. It doesn't start in space, it starts underground, and that one decision changes the entire feeling, because instead of vast galaxies, you begin in confinement, darkness, restriction, a world that feels closed off before it ever expands. So when the story finally moves outward, it feels earned. That contrast becomes the film's core strength. Light versus dark, freedom versus control, movement versus limitation. And unlike many imitators, it understands progression. It doesn't give everything at once. It builds toward it. The character journey reflects that. Not a hero already defined, but someone discovering identity piece by piece. That gradual shift creates investment, because growth here isn't instant. It's layered, and visually, the film takes risks. Early 3D effects, bold colors, sharp contrasts that don't try to hide their artificial nature, but lean into it. That creates a distinct texture, not realistic, but immersive in its own way. And then there's the pacing. It balances stillness and movement carefully. Quiet moments that allow tension to form, followed by bursts of action that release it. That rhythm keeps attention locked, because it never stays in one state for too long, and by the time it reaches its larger moments, they feel deserved. Not because of scale, but because of buildup. And that's what separates it. It doesn't just imitate structure, it understands it. 4. Masters of the Universe, 1987. It doesn't begin in space. It begins somewhere familiar. And that choice immediately breaks expectation. Because instead of transporting you into a distant galaxy, the film pulls its conflict into a recognizable world. Streets, buildings, ordinary environments that suddenly feel unstable. That shift creates contrast, fantasy colliding with reality, and instead of expanding outward, the story compresses inward, bringing larger-than-life characters into confined spaces. That changes how power is perceived, because when something extraordinary exists in an ordinary setting, it feels more disruptive, more immediate. And then there's the antagonist, not distant, not abstract, present, controlled, calculated. Every appearance feels deliberate, not overwhelming, and that restraint builds tension, because you're not waiting for chaos, you're waiting for control to break. The pacing reflects that too. In moments stretch just enough to create anticipation, then shift quickly into action. Not constant movement, but timed release. That rhythm keeps engagement steady, and visually, the film leans into contrast. dark interiors against bursts of energy, silence followed by sudden impact. Nothing feels balanced, everything feels on edge. And that's where it finds strength, not by matching scale, but by changing context. It doesn't try to be bigger, it tries to feel closer. And in doing that, it becomes harder to ignore. 3. The Man Who Saves the World, 1982. It starts with something that shouldn't be there. Familiar footage, recognizable movement, pieces that don't belong to this film, but are suddenly part of it. And that immediately breaks structure, because instead of building its own world, it pulls fragments from another, not subtly, directly. And that creates a strange kind of tension. You're watching something that feels both known and completely unstable, because the rules aren't consistent. Scenes shift abruptly, tone changes without warning, action appears without buildup. And normally, that would collapse the experience. Here, it does the opposite, because unpredictability replaces expectation. You stop trying to follow the story and start reacting to it. Every moment becomes uncertain, and that uncertainty holds attention. Then there's the physicality. Action isn't polished, it's raw. Movements feel heavier, impacts feel less controlled. That roughness creates intensity, not through precision, but through lack of it. And within that chaos, something unexpected happens. The film develops identity, and not through consistency, but through collision. Different tones, different sources, different intentions, all forced into one structure. And instead of blending, they clash. That clash becomes the experience. It's not smooth, it's not refined, but it's impossible to predict. And in a medium built on patterns, unpredictability becomes power. 2. Battle Beyond the Stars, 1980. It opens with clarity, a defined threat, a clear objective, a structure that feels familiar but stable. And that stability is its advantage. Because instead of leaning into chaos, the film organizes itself. It builds deliberately. Characters are introduced with purpose, each one distinct, not just visually, but functionally. They aren't just part of the story, they are the structure, and that creates progression. You're not just watching events unfold, you're watching pieces assemble. That assembly builds anticipation, because once all elements are in place, something is coming, and when it arrives, it feels earned. The film understands rhythm, setup, expansion, confrontation, not rushed, not fragmented, controlled. And within that control, it allows moments to breathe. Dialogue isn't just filler, it defines relationships. Interactions carry weight. Because each character represents more than themselves, they represent contribution, and that collective dynamic creates tension, not from uncertainty, but from expectation. What needs to happen? The question is, how? And that question keeps engagement steady. Visually, it mirrors larger influences, but doesn't rely on them. Instead, it reinforces its own structure through repetition and variation, familiar elements arranged differently. And that difference matters, because it turns imitation into adaptation, not copying scale, but reconstructing it. And in that reconstruction, the film finds its strength, not as a replacement, but as a reinterpretation that holds its own. 1. Star Crash, 1978. It doesn't begin with restraint. It begins with excess. Color, motion, sound. Everything arrives at once, without hesitation, without buildup. And that immediately sets the tone. This isn't trying to recreate Star Wars, it's trying to overwhelm you. Every visual is heightened, lights are brighter, movements are slower, reactions are sharper, nothing is subtle. And that lack of subtlety becomes its identity. Because instead of hiding its artificial nature, it amplifies it. Spaceships don't glide, they pose. Characters don't react, they perform. Every moment feels intentional, even when it's exaggerated. And that exaggeration creates rhythm. You're not watching for realism, you're watching for impact. Scene after scene delivers something visually distinct, not always logical, not always consistent, but always noticeable. And that consistency of impact keeps attention locked, because just as one moment settles, another replaces it. Then there's the pacing. It doesn't slow down to explain. It moves forward with confidence, even when that confidence feels misplaced. And strangely, that works. because hesitation breaks immersion. This film never hesitates. It commits fully to its world, no matter how artificial it feels. And that commitment creates engagement, not because it convinces you, but because it doesn't need to. It pulls you into its rhythm and refuses to let go. And by the time you realize how chaotic it is, you're already invested, not in the story, but in the experience. And that experience, loud, unpredictable, and unapologetically bold, is exactly what makes it unforgettable. It started as imitation, but somewhere along the way, these films became something else. Not polished, not perfect, but impossible to ignore. Because sometimes, when structure breaks, creativity slips through, and that's what makes them last. So the real question is, how many more failures are we overlooking right now that might actually be worth watching?